The debt deal. The night was dark and silent. Only the soft hum of a spaceship broke the silence. It landed on the edge of a human colony, far from the main city. Dust flew in the air. The ship was black and silver, shaped like a blade. Its door opened slowly, and 3 figures stepped out. One of them was a human man. His name was Elias Vorn. His face looked tired. His eyes were filled with fear and regret. He was in debt, deep debt. The other 2 were aliens, tall and strong, with golden armor and sharp eyes. They stood beside him like guards. But Elias was not their friend. He was their prisoner. Behind them, inside the ship, a girl stood still. Her skin glowed faintly blue under the light. Her silver eyes watched everything without emotion. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her name was Siren. She was not born on Earth. She was found by Elias many years ago, alone in the wreckage of a crashed alien pod. He raised her like a daughter, but now she was the payment. The aliens handed Elias a contract. It was written in both human and alien language. "This ends your debt," one of the aliens said coldly. "In return, the girl is ours. She will be given to House Terran, a noble family from our world. She will be married to a human as a symbol of peace." Elias hesitated. His hand shook as he held the pen. "She's just a child," he whispered. "She is not a child anymore," the alien replied. "And she is not human." Elias turned to Siren. She was now walking down the ramp slowly, her feet silent. Her long silver hair moved with the wind. Her face was calm, too calm. She looked at Elias, but said nothing. He wanted to speak, to explain, to say sorry, but no words came out. Siren stopped in front of him. Her voice was cold, like ice. "I understand." Elias opened his mouth, then closed it again. He signed the paper. The deal was done. The aliens nodded. One of them touched a device on his wrist. A small cube floated in the air and showed a glowing map. "We leave now. The ship will take her to Earth Sector 9. Her groom is waiting." Siren didn't resist. She walked into a smaller pod ship. The door closed behind her with a hiss. She sat down inside, alone. No luggage, no memories, just silence. The ship flew away, leaving Elias standing under the dark sky, tears falling from his eyes. The journey was short but quiet. Inside the ship, Siren looked out the window. Stars passed by like falling lights. Her hands rested on her lap. Her heart beat slowly. Not fast, not excited, just calm. She had been trained for this, not by Elias, but by the cartel who once found her. They taught her not to feel. Emotions were weakness. She was special. Her mind was different. Faster, smarter, stronger. But still, something inside her remembered the way Elias used to smile. The way he read her stories. The way he protected her when others were afraid of her glowing eyes. She shook her head. Those memories didn't matter now. When the ship landed, the door opened to a new world. The sky was orange and the air warm. A man in a clean uniform greeted her. "Welcome to Sector 9. You must be Siren." She nodded. "I am Commander Niles. I'll take you to your groom. His name is Kale. He's an engineer. Kind man. You'll be safe." Safe. The word meant nothing to her. She followed Niles into a hover car. It flew over a city that was half metal, half forest. Strange animals moved below. Children played in fields. Siren watched with blank eyes. At last, they reached a small town. Simple houses, quiet streets, a peaceful place. Commander Niles stopped in front of a white house. "He's inside. You can meet him now." Siren walked up to the door. Her heart beat once, then again, a little faster. The door opened. A young man stood there, human, about 25. Brown hair, kind eyes. His name was Kale. When his eyes met Siren's, something happened. Not outside, but inside. She didn't show it. Her face stayed calm, her body still. But deep inside, something cracked. She had been traded like an object, sold like a tool. But this man looked at her like she was human. He didn't bow. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak right away. He just smiled. And for the first time in years, Siren felt confused. Was this kindness? Was this part of the deal? Or was this something more? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The Groom. The morning sun rose over Sector 9. Light spilled through the tall glass windows of Cale's home. Birds flew across the orange sky. It should have been a normal day, but Cale's hands were shaking. He stood in front of the mirror, fixing the collar of his shirt for the third time. His dark brown hair refused to stay in place. He wasn't nervous because of the clothes. He was nervous because of her. Today, he was meeting his bride. But not just any bride. An alien girl, one he had never met, never seen, and didn't choose. It all started a month ago, when the Council of Sector 9 offered him a deal. "We need this alliance," they said. "You're respected, smart, and unmarried. She's not dangerous, just different." Cale had refused at first. "I'm not interested in a political marriage." But then came the warnings. Alien cartels are expanding. If we don't build trust with their kind, we won't survive the next attack. Cale was a man of logic. He believed in peace, not war. In machines, not magic. In facts, not feelings. So he agreed, not for love, but for peace. He expected someone cold, someone silent, a girl raised by aliens, trained to obey, not feel. And yet, when the door opened yesterday and he saw Siren for the first time, his thoughts froze. She wasn't what he imagined. She was quiet, yes, but not broken. She looked at him with eyes that held galaxies, eyes that didn't ask for pity or protection, eyes that watched the world like it was a puzzle she had already solved. And in that 1 second, Cale felt something strange. He felt seen. Now, 1 day later, they sat across from each other in his kitchen. 2 mugs of tea sat between them. Steam rose quietly. Outside, a soft wind moved the grass. Siren hadn't said a word since she arrived. She moved like a shadow, smooth and silent. She didn't touch anything unless asked. She didn't ask questions. Cale cleared his throat. "The tea is safe. I checked the minerals myself." Siren looked at the mug, then back at him. "I don't need food every day." Her voice was calm, like water running over stone. Not cold, but not warm either. "I know," Cale replied, "but you can still try." She looked at the tea again, then picked up the mug. She didn't drink. She just held it, like she was testing its weight. "I don't belong here," she said after a pause. Cale leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Neither do I, most days." She tilted her head slightly. "You're human. This is your home." He smiled a little. "I build machines. They understand me better than people do." She studied him, not like a woman studying a man, but like a scientist watching a new subject. "Why did you accept this marriage?" she asked. Cale didn't answer right away. He thought about the war, the debt, the council's threats. Then he said, "Because I hoped maybe we'd both get a second chance." Siren looked down at her tea. The surface was still. No reflection. Just warmth trapped in a cup. Later that day, Cale showed her around the workshop behind his house. Machines stood in corners, wires tangled across walls, and half-built drones hovered in the air. Siren moved slowly, eyes scanning everything. "You build things that fly." "Yes," Cale said. "And some that fight. But I prefer building things that protect." He picked up a small device the size of a coin. "This one detects hidden tech, useful if someone plants a tracker on you." He glanced at her, but she didn't react. He continued, "Do you know if they put anything inside you before sending you here?" Seren looked away. Yes. Cale froze. They did. She nodded. I removed it. When? On the way here. I used a blade. It hurt. He stared at her in silence. She said it like it was nothing. No emotion. No pain. Cale felt a chill. What kind of life had she lived? I don't want to be watched, she added. Not by them. Not by you. You won't be, Cale said softly. Seren turned to face him. You're kind. But kindness is not trust. Cale nodded slowly. Fair. Then let's build trust. One piece at a time. That night, Seren sat near the window. Outside, the moon rose slowly. Cale brought her a blanket and placed it beside her. You can sleep if you want, he said. She didn't move. I don't sleep much. Bad dreams. No dreams. Just memories. He sat down a few feet away. Want to talk about them? No. Silence filled the room. Then softly she said, the last time I trusted someone, they sold me. Cale looked at her, but didn't speak. I was 9. He found me in a shipwreck. Fed me. Taught me words. I thought I was safe. And now? She looked up at the moon. Now I'm learning again. But I don't know what for. Cale stood and walked toward the door. You're not a prisoner here. Not a deal. Not a tool. He paused. You're Seren. That's enough. Then he left her alone with the stars. For the first time since arriving, Seren pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, she felt warm. Broken chains. The sky over Sector 9 was calm, but Seren wasn't. She stood in Cale's workshop, watching a small drone hover in the air. Her silver eyes followed its every move. It spun, dipped, and danced between the metal beams like a bird. Cale controlled it with a simple glove on his hand. Nice, right? He said with a smile. Seren nodded slowly. You built it? Yeah. Took me 3 weeks. She stepped closer. It moves like it's alive. Cale glanced at her. Machines only do what we teach them. They're not alive. Seren stared at the drone. Neither am I. Cale lowered his glove, and the drone gently landed. Is that what they told you? He asked. They didn't need to, she replied. They just used me. Later, as Cale worked on a console, Seren walked alone through the workshop. Something was buzzing in her mind. A faint pulse. A warning. It had started a few days ago. A strange feeling under her skin, like a soft tickle near her spine. She ignored it at first, but it returned, stronger each time. She reached behind her neck and pressed 2 fingers to her skin. There it was again, a tiny pulse, a signal. Someone was watching her. She remembered what Cale had said in Part 2. This one detects hidden tech, useful if someone plants a tracker on you. She had removed the first tracker during her journey, cut it out with a blade. But now, there was another. Smaller, smarter, hidden deeper. Her body stiffened. They hadn't just sold her. They had marked her. That night, after Cale had gone to sleep, Seren slipped into the workshop. She opened a drawer and found the small circular scanner Cale had shown her. It blinked softly in her palm. She turned it on and held it to the back of her neck. Beep, beep, beep. A red light flashed. It was there. She pressed a button and scanned deeper. A tiny image appeared on the screen. Not just a tracker. A transmitter, with memory storage. They weren't just tracking her. They had copied everything. Her voice, her movements, even her thoughts when she connected to alien tech. Her fists tightened. She wasn't free. Not yet. The next morning, Seren stood in front of the mirror. Her eyes were different now. Sharper, colder. She walked into the kitchen. Cale was making breakfast. You built that scanner to find trackers, she said. Cale nodded. Yeah. Why? She held it out. I found one. His eyes widened. Again. She nodded. Cale took the scanner and looked at the results. His face went pale. "This isn't just a tracker," he said. "It's sending data, maybe even live audio. Can you remove it?" He hesitated. "It's close to your nerve lines. One wrong move, and you could lose speech, or worse." "I don't care," Saren said quietly. Cale looked into her eyes. "I do." They spent hours planning. Cale studied the signal. He built a small jammer to block the transmissions temporarily. Saren watched him work. His hands moved fast but carefully. Focused. Determined. She remembered the first time she saw him. The way he smiled. The way he didn't look at her like a weapon. Now he was risking everything to protect her. A small warmth lit in her chest. She didn't know what it was. Not yet. Outside, rain began to fall. The sky turned gray. Cale gave her a small device. "This will jam the signal, but only for a few hours. We'll need to disable the tracker fully tomorrow." Saren took the device and clipped it under her collar. Then she turned to him. "Why are you helping me?" Cale blinked. "Because I want to." "That's not a reason." He smiled faintly. "Okay, because I don't want anyone to use you again. You're not a thing to be passed around. You're a person." Saren looked at him for a long time. Then slowly she nodded. That night, something moved outside. Saren felt it first, a faint tremor in the air. A silent breath. She stepped to the window. A figure stood in the shadows. Tall, lean, dressed in black armor. Not human. A bounty hunter. She didn't panic. She turned off the lights and walked quietly to Cale's room. He was asleep, head resting on an open book. She touched his shoulder. He woke instantly. "What is it?" "Someone's outside," she whispered. "Not from here." Cale jumped up. "Stay here. I'll—" "No," she said. "I'll handle it." She walked to the front door and opened it. The bounty hunter raised a hand. "Saren, I've come for you." She didn't speak. "You're valuable," he said. "They didn't tell your groom the truth, did they?" She narrowed her eyes. "What truth?" He smiled. "You're not just rare. You're dangerous. You're designed." Saren clenched her fists. "I'm not yours." "Maybe not," he said. "But someone's coming. Bigger than me. They want you back. And next time, they won't knock." Then he vanished into the shadows. Saren closed the door. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage. Later, as Cale checked the door locks, Saren stood in silence. "What did he say to you?" Cale asked. She looked up. "That I'm not safe. And neither are you." "What do we do?" Saren looked at him, and for the first time, her voice trembled. "We fight." Heart code. The sky was quiet, but inside Saren's mind, a storm had begun. She sat on the roof of Cale's home, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the stars. Her hands rested in her lap. A cold wind brushed her skin, but she didn't move. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone was coming. But tonight, Saren wasn't afraid. She was changing. Earlier that day, Saren had woken from something strange. A dream. She never dreamed before. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a nightmare. It was something new. In the dream, she was standing on a field of glass. Lights danced above her, and Cale stood beside her. He reached out his hand. When she touched it, her skin lit up like starlight. She woke up sweating, confused. Her heart was beating fast. Too fast. She walked to the mirror and stared at herself. Something inside her was waking up. Something old. Something buried. Cale was working in the lab when she came downstairs. His face lit up when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "You look different." "I had a dream," she said softly. He looked surprised. "You dream?" "Not before." Cale set down his tools. "What was it?" Saren hesitated. "You were there." He smiled. "Was I useful?" Siren looked away. You were kind. She didn't know how to explain what she felt. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was warmth mixed with confusion, like stepping into sunlight after living underground. Kale walked closer. You don't have to explain everything. Just feel it. I'm not used to feeling, she said. I was trained to shut it off. They said feelings make you weak. They were wrong, Kale said. Feelings make us human. I'm not human, Siren whispered. Kale looked into her eyes. No, you're more. That afternoon, Siren joined Kale in the workshop. He gave her a device to tinker with, an old flying drone. Let's see what you can do, he said. To his surprise, Siren understood it instantly. She recoded its logic in minutes, added new flight patterns, rewired the energy source. Kale watched her in amazement. You're faster than any engineer I've met. I learned fast, she said. My mind was built for it. Built. She nodded. I'm not just a girl. I'm part of something called Project Lyria. An old experiment. Hidden. Buried. Even I don't know everything. Kale leaned forward. What kind of experiment? Siren looked up. A living map. A bridge between species. They made me to hold data. Language, memories, tech blueprints, star paths. But they feared me, so they locked my emotions. Blocked parts of my mind. Why? Kale asked. Because if I felt too much, I might choose my own path. Kale shook his head. So you're not just running from bounty hunters. You're carrying something powerful inside you. Siren nodded. Something that others would kill to control. That night, the town held a small gathering. A festival of lights. People danced, laughed, and lit floating lanterns that rose into the sky. Kale invited Siren. At first, she refused. I don't belong in crowds, she said. Maybe, Kale replied, but tonight isn't about belonging. It's about feeling alive. So she went. At first, she stood in the shadows, watching. Children ran past her, holding glowing balloons. Music played softly in the air. A little girl ran up and handed her a lantern. It's for someone you care about, the girl said. Siren stared at the lantern. It was made of soft paper and tiny lights. She thought of Elias, the man who raised her and then traded her away. She thought of the bounty hunter who called her a weapon. Then she thought of Kale, who looked at her like she mattered. She lit the lantern and let it go. It floated up into the night sky, glowing brighter than all the others. Kale walked up beside her. Did you make a wish? No, she said, but I think I found one. Later, they walked home under the stars. Siren spoke quietly. When I was small, I used to believe the stars could talk, that they held messages for me. Maybe they do, Kale said. Maybe you're just now learning to hear them. Siren stopped walking. I'm scared. He looked at her. Of what? That if I keep feeling like this, I'll never be the same. Kale took her hand. Good. That means you're growing. She didn't pull away. For the first time, she let someone touch her without fear, and her heart didn't race from danger. It raced from hope. Back at the house, Siren powered down for rest. But her mind stayed active. Data began unlocking inside her brain. Old code, sealed memories, blueprints of something ancient. A symbol appeared in her vision. A circle with wings. It pulsed once, then faded. She opened her eyes, heart pounding. Something's calling me, she whispered. In the corner of the room, Kale sat awake, reading a report. He looked up. What is it? There's a ship, she said, buried deep under this colony. Hidden for centuries. I think it's connected to me. Kale stood up. Are you sure? Yes, she whispered. And I think it's waking up. The attack. It began with silence. A strange silence. Too perfect. Too still. Siren felt it before anyone else. She stood in the garden outside Kale's home, touching a small flower with glowing petals. The air around her felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. No clouds, just shadows. A cold wind swept through the colony. The ground beneath her feet gave a soft rumble. Inside the house, Cale dropped his tool and ran to the window. "What is that?" he asked. Siren was already walking toward the hill behind the workshop. "They're here," she said. Cale followed her, heart pounding. "The cartel." She nodded once. "They found me." High above them, 3 alien ships appeared through a dark mist. They weren't like the transport ships Siren had seen before. These were sleek, black, and armed. Red lights glowed under their wings. The town alarm began to ring, loud, sharp, and desperate. People screamed. Children cried. Homes shut their steel doors. Commander Niles appeared on a public screen. "We're under attack. All citizens move to safe shelters. Defense units report to the west gate." Cale grabbed Siren's arm. "We have to go." She pulled away gently. "No, I'm not hiding." He stared at her. "You'll be taken." She turned to face him fully. "Not this time." The cartel didn't land quietly. They crashed into Sector 9 like fire falling from the sky. Explosions tore through the edge of the town. Dust rose. Buildings shook. From the smoke, alien soldiers emerged, armor black as night, eyes hidden behind glass masks. They carried energy blades and pulse rifles. They marched forward, step by step. At their front was a figure in red. Not just a soldier. A commander. He raised a loudspeaker. "Return the girl, or burn." Siren stepped forward, standing between the alien army and the people of Sector 9. Cale ran after her. "Siren, don't." But she didn't stop. She raised her hands. The lights around her pulsed. Symbols glowed faintly under her skin. "I'm not yours anymore," she said. The cartel soldiers opened fire. Blue blasts shot across the field. But Siren was faster. She lifted one hand, and a glowing shield burst out of thin air, pure energy. The blasts hit it and disappeared like sparks in water. Gasps echoed from nearby rooftops. People were watching. Siren wasn't just resisting. She was fighting back. Cale pulled out a handheld blaster and stood beside her. "You're not doing this alone." "Stay behind me," she said. "I said what I said," he replied. They fought together. Cale aimed and shot down 2 soldiers. Siren moved like lightning, using the glowing code lines in her skin to create barriers, short bursts of force and shockwaves. Each time a soldier got close, she pushed them back, not with fear, but with power. But there were too many. And more were coming. From behind the hills, a second wave of cartel ships began to descend. "We can't hold them all," Cale shouted. Siren's eyes burned bright. "Then I'll give them something they can't handle." She stepped forward and pressed her palm to the ground. The earth shook. A glowing circle formed under her feet. Ancient symbols lit up around her. "It's not just power," she whispered. "It's memory." Suddenly, a voice echoed in her head. "Starborn, your time has come." The ground split open. Beneath it, a buried ship began to rise. Massive, ancient, alive. It was the one she had seen in her dreams. The one that had been waiting for her. The cartel commander froze. "What is that?" Siren stood tall, wind blowing through her hair. "My inheritance," she said. The ship rose from the earth with a deep roar. It wasn't made of metal. It was made of light, crystal, and memory. The cartel soldiers began to retreat. They knew what it was. The starship Lyria, lost for centuries, hidden from war, and now reawakened. Siren stepped inside. The ship lit up under her touch. A voice echoed again. "Command accepted. Heart signature confirmed." She turned to Cale. "You need to get to the shelters. I'll stop them." Cale shook his head. "Not without me." She reached out and touched his hand. Then stay close. The ship's weapons activated. Beams of light fired from its wings, disarming the incoming ships. The cartel had no defense against something this old and this powerful. Within minutes, the sky was clear. The soldiers fled. The commander was gone. Sector 9 was safe. For now. As silence returned, people stepped out from their homes. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply stared at Siren, not with fear, but with awe. She walked down from the ship, skin still glowing faintly. Her eyes were calm, but her heart raced. Kale walked beside her, bruised but smiling. "You saved them." "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "You're not alone anymore." That night, as the town repaired what was broken, Siren stood on the edge of the garden again. She looked up at the stars. "I'm not a prisoner," she whispered. "Not a weapon. Not property. I'm a person." Kale came to her side. "What now?" She didn't answer at first. Then she turned to him. "We find the truth," she said, "about who I am, and what they were really trying to create." He nodded. Together. She smiled for real this time. It was small, but it was hers. Truth revealed. Siren stood alone inside the ancient ship. The walls around her pulsed with soft light, like a heartbeat. Symbols floated in the air, old language she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. The ship was more than metal. It was alive, and it was connected to her. Kale waited outside, watching the sunrise from the garden. The town was still rebuilding after the attack, but peace had returned, for now. Inside, Siren reached out and touched one of the floating symbols. A voice echoed. Memory chain unlocked. Suddenly, light burst from the walls, and Siren saw the truth. She wasn't born. She was made. Created in a lab, far from Earth, by an ancient alien race called the Oralans, creatures of light and energy. They had once ruled half the galaxy, not with war, but with knowledge. They wanted peace between species, so they created a being who could hold all languages, cultures, and history inside her. A living bridge. Project Lyria. Siren. She wasn't just a girl. She was a vault, a map, and a key. The cartel didn't want her for her powers. They wanted her because she could lead them to something far more dangerous. The Star Core. An ancient source of power buried deep in the galaxy. A source so strong, it could control entire civilizations. But the Star Core could only be unlocked by a specific code. That code lived in Siren's DNA. Siren fell to her knees. The visions ended. Her body shook. All her life, she thought she was unwanted, abandoned, traded. But she was built for purpose. Now, others wanted to use her again. Not because she was weak, but because she was too strong. She stepped out of the ship slowly. Kale saw her face and ran to her. "Are you okay? What did you see?" "I know who I am," she said, her voice low. "I was never meant to be a bride. I was never meant to belong to anyone." She looked into his eyes. "I'm a key, a map, a code wrapped in skin." Kale didn't speak for a long time. Then he asked gently, "And what do you want to be?" Her lips parted, and for the first time, she didn't know the answer. That night, Siren couldn't sleep. She sat near the fire while Kale slept nearby, breathing softly. She remembered the bounty hunter's words. "She's not just a girl. She's a weapon." And the cartel commander's voice. "Bring her, alive or broken." She looked at her hands. They had saved people. They had destroyed machines. But what were they really? Hands of peace or destruction? She reached for her wrist and tapped a hidden panel in her skin. It lit up, revealing old data. She pressed a code. A map appeared in the air. The Star Core's location. Far from Earth. Hidden in a dying system. But something else appeared too. A blinking dot. Moving fast. headed straight for Sector 9. A third party. Someone worse. Not the cartel. Not bounty hunters. But the builders, the ones who made her. And now they were coming to claim what they left behind. At dawn, Saren woke Cale. He rubbed his eyes. More dreams. No, she said. More truth. She showed him the blinking dot. They're coming, she said. My creators. The Oralans, or what's left of them. I thought they wanted peace. Maybe once, Saren replied. But not now. They want to use the Starcore. To start over. And I'm the key. Cale stood up slowly. Then we have a choice. She looked at him. What choice? Run, or face them. Saren didn't answer. Then she turned to the ship. I'm tired of running. Later, she stood before the people of Sector 9. Some were still afraid of her. Some were still unsure. But most were grateful. She spoke clearly. I'm not one of you. But I've bled for you. Fought for you. Laughed with you. I don't know what I am anymore. But I know this. My past doesn't control me. My creators don't own me. I choose who I become. There was silence. Then an old man stepped forward. You are one of us now. Others followed. And for the first time, Saren felt something real. Not just warmth. Not just hope. But belonging. That evening, Cale found her packing gear. You're leaving. I have to, she said. I need to destroy the Starcore, or at least hide it again, if it falls into the wrong hands. I know, Cale said. Then I'm coming with you. She looked at him. This might be a one-way trip. I don't care. Why? He smiled. Because I didn't fall in love with your purpose, Saren. I fell in love with you. She froze. Her eyes filled with light. For the first time, Saren didn't hide it. She stepped forward and kissed him. Soft. Real. Human. The ship powered up again. The Starborn was leaving Earth. Not as cargo. Not as property. But as someone who chose her path. And for the first time, the universe would have to face Saren. On her own terms. Heart of the stars. The ship moved through space like a silent shadow. Stars drifted past the windows. Planets glowed in the distance. Asteroids floated like sleeping giants. Inside the ship, Saren stood in silence, watching the stars. She wore a dark suit lined with energy thread, armor made from the ship's core itself. Her hair flowed like silver flame. Her eyes glowed gently. She didn't look like a girl anymore. She looked like what she had become. A Starborn. Behind her, Cale stepped into the command chamber, holding 2 warm mugs. You didn't sleep. I don't need to, she said, without turning. Still, he said, handing her a mug. It's good for the soul. Saren accepted it with a soft nod. Outside the window, a massive object appeared in the distance. A dead star system. The home of the Starcore. They entered orbit around a silent world. It was dark, covered in silver dust and broken ruins. Huge rings of ice circled its atmosphere. And in the center, deep under the surface, was a glowing red pulse. The Starcore. Alive. Waiting. Saren walked to the center of the ship. A panel rose from the floor, revealing a key-shaped device, designed to respond only to her DNA. Cale looked at her. Do you really have to destroy it? Yes, she said. If anyone controls the Starcore, they control all life connected to it. Every system, every planet, even Earth. He frowned. But it's part of you. She touched her chest. That's why I have to be the one to end it. As they landed on the surface, the ship went silent. It was as if the planet itself knew she had returned. The wind didn't blow. The dust didn't move. Saren stepped out onto the stone ground. The symbols from her dreams were etched into the rocks. They led her forward. Cale walked beside her, weapon ready. They reached an ancient gate. It opened without a sound. Inside, the Starcore floated in the air like a heart of fire. It pulsed slowly, calm. powerful, beautiful. Siren walked toward it. And then, the shadows came. From the edges of the chamber, tall figures emerged. The builders, her creators. But they didn't look like the glowing beings from the old memories. They were broken, hollow, part machine, part light. One stepped forward. "Siren," he said, "you've returned to your origin." "I didn't come to obey," she replied. "I came to choose." "You were made for one purpose," he said, "to unlock the star core. Nothing more." "No," she said, "I was made to be more." The builder reached out a hand. "Come home." Siren looked at him, and then smashed the key on the ground. The builders roared. Light flashed. Weapons appeared. Kale raised his blaster. "You're not touching her." Siren's hands lifted as the energy inside her flared. She wasn't just a map now. She was the firewall. The final lock. She could feel it. Every code, every signal, every secret. She reached toward the star core. "Command. Self-seal," she said. The star core pulsed red. "Do you wish to erase the master access?" "Yes," Siren whispered. "I'm no one's tool." The builders attacked. Kale fired. Siren fought with light itself. She used the ship's energy through her veins, building shields, beams, and gravity fields. The chamber shook. The star core flickered. The builders screamed. And then, silence. The chamber went dark. Only Siren stood, breathing, shaking, alive. The builders were gone. The star core was sealed, and the galaxy was safe. Later, inside the ship, Kale wrapped a blanket around her. "You did it," he said. She looked down at her hands. "I don't feel powerful." "You don't need to be," he said. "You just need to be you." Siren smiled softly. Then her smile faded. "I can't go back to who I was," she said. "Too much has changed." Kale took her hand. "Then build someone new." Weeks later, they returned to Sector 9. The people greeted them not as strangers, but as heroes. Siren didn't give a speech. She just helped rebuild. She planted trees with children, fixed machines, sat under stars with Kale. Her heart still raced when he touched her hand. Not with fear, but with something simple. Something new. Love. One night, as the stars glowed bright above them, Kale asked her gently, "Do you miss the power?" Siren smiled. "I don't miss being feared." "What do you miss?" She looked at the stars. "Nothing," she whispered, "because everything I want is here." She looked at him, and he looked back like she was the universe itself. Once she was cold. Once she was used. Once she had no voice. But now she chose her path, her heart, her name. Siren of Earth, starborn of peace, bride of her own will.